Picture this. It's 2 a.m. and you're scrolling through social media, and then you see a post about neurodivergence that stops you cold. Wait, you think, that sounds exactly like me. But then the familiar voice kicks in. I can't be neurodivergent. I have friends. I went to college. I hold down a job. I've made it this far. Maybe you have been called too sensitive your whole life. Maybe you feel like everyone else got a manual for being human that somehow got lost in your mail. Maybe you're exhausted from a lifetime of wondering why everything feels so much harder for you than it seems for everyone else. But what if I told you that feeling isn't a character flaw, but it's a clue? What if those differences you've been apologizing for your entire life are actually your brain's way of telling you something important about who you are? Today we are finding the GPS for your own journey, getting the right coordinates for your own life. Welcome to the revolution of recognition. Welcome to NeuroRebel, the podcast that challenges conventional narratives about neurodivergence with research-informed analysis and unapologetic authenticity. I'm your host, Anita. I'm autistic, gifted, retired law professor, and proud resident of Mexico, where I create content that bridges academic rigor with lived experience. If this is your first time here, welcome to our community of critical thinkers and rebels. We don't do inspirational content, and we don't oversimplify. We definitely don't romanticize neurodivergence. Instead, we dive deep into the science, challenge the assumptions, and center the voices that matter most, ours. Before we begin today's investigation, a quick favor. If this podcast adds value to your life, please take 30 seconds to follow or subscribe on your platform of choice. Share it with someone who needs to hear these conversations. First, let's clarify what we are talking about today. Late diagnosed neurodivergence, autism, ADHD, giftedness, and their intersections. It refers to people who receive their diagnosis in adolescence or adulthood, and often after decades of living without understanding their own neurological wiring. And giftedness isn't just being smart. It's a neurological difference characterized by intense processing, heightened sensitivities, and a synchronous development that can mask other neurodivergences or be misunderstood as emotional instability. This isn't just about missing childhood diagnoses. It's about entire generations, particularly women, people assigned female at birth, people of color, and multiple neurodivergent individuals whose neurological differences were overlooked, misdiagnosed as anxiety, depression, or personality disorders, or even dismissed as character flaws. And why does late diagnosis matter? Because it represents both individual liberation and systemic failure, and a personal relief meets political awakening. And that's where our story really begins. Every late diagnosed neurodivergent person becomes their own GPS technician by necessity. We spend years, sometimes decades, following directions that seem logical, but keep leading us in circles. And we are left wondering why we never arrive where we're supposed to be going. You know that feeling when your GPS has the wrong coordinates? You're driving to an important destination, but every turn feels wrong. Every route seems unnecessarily complicated. And you keep thinking that you're a terrible driver, that you can't follow simple directions. and the app keeps telling you you're off route, no matter how carefully you follow the instructions. The revelation isn't that you were lost. It's that you were following the wrong coordinates entirely. My internal compass of awakening came after I had burnt out of academia so completely that reading, something I had done effortlessly for 5 decades, became neurologically impossible. I was sitting in my apartment, surrounded by the silence I had finally allowed myself to feel, when a friend calls me and wanted to talk about her autistic son. She didn't want to talk about it as a diagnosis, but as an explanation of what was going on with him. She told me, he needs these specific conditions to think clearly. He has the intense interests that bring him joy, and he just processes the world differently. But I think that's not a problem to solve. I think it's a reality to accommodate. And something in my nervous system went very, very still. That night, I did what any researcher does when presented with a new framework. I tested it against my actual experience. Except the route was my own life, and the framework was neurodivergence. Every article I read felt like my internal compass finally saying, recalculating, and then showing me a route that actually made sense to me. The sensory overwhelm I had attributed to stress, the social exhaustion I had labeled as introversion, and the rigid routines I had called discipline, even the emotional intensity I had been told was just too much, was actually autism and giftedness. And the burnout was brutal. For the first time, my internal wayfinding made sense. Not as a collection of wrong turns to correct, but as a coherent journey with its own logic, its own optimal routes, and its own magnificent complexity. Take a breath with me for a moment. If you are recognizing yourself in this navigation metaphor, whether it's the ADHD brain that hyperfocuses on fascinating details while losing track of time, or the gifted mind that connects patterns others miss but feels perpetually misunderstood, or even the autistic nervous system that craves predictability in an unpredictable world, that tightness in your chest, that thing you're feeling, is your body responding to truth. You're not imagining this. You're not being dramatic. You're finally getting accurate coordinates for territory you've been traveling your whole life. Now let's talk about why your internal compass stayed broken for so long. Let's talk about masking. Because if you're getting diagnosed later in life, masking is probably why your GPS stayed broken for so long. Masking isn't just pretending to be someone else. It's like manually overriding your compass every single day and forcing yourself to take routes that feel wrong because that's what the world expects of you. You study other people like you're learning a foreign language or memorizing phrases and responses until you can navigate social situations without anyone noticing you're using a completely different operating system. I became a virtuoso of social route override. I studied human behavior like constitutional law, memorizing the precedents of social interaction. I learned to make eye contact for exactly the right amount of time. I practiced small talk like I was preparing for oral arguments. And I suppressed my stims, swallowed my special interests, and performed neurotypicality so convincingly that I fooled everyone, including myself. Though, honestly, I think my students always suspected something Different because Professor Anita would spend 20 minutes explaining the constitutional implications of a semicolon. Well, it turns out that it wasn't just academic thoroughness. That was my gifted brain finding patterns everywhere, and my autistic need for precision colliding in beautiful, nerdy chaos. But let me tell you about Camilla, not her real name, a bilingual customer service representative who discovered she was both ADHD and autistic at 28. Camilla became so good at the cheerful, helpful persona that customers would specifically request her. She had scripts for every situation: the angry customer, the confused customer, and even the chatty customer. She thought she was just excellent at her job, which she was. But what she was actually excellent at was running a complex social route override for 8 hours a day, 5 days a week, while her ADHD brain craved stimulation and her autistic nervous system needed predictable patterns. Research by Dr. Dora Raymaker and her colleagues reveals the neurobiological cost of this constant override. Masking creates a state of chronic cognitive overload, where your brain is constantly running translation software between your authentic responses and those that are socially acceptable behaviors. Over time, this leads to neurodivergent burnout. And that's a state where your navigation system crashes and you temporarily lose access to abilities you once had. And this is what is called skill regression. And here's what my burnout looked like. I couldn't grade papers. I couldn't return emails. Fluorescent lights became neurologically unbearable. I started canceling classes, something I had never done in 20 years of teaching. I thought I was having a breakdown, but it turns out I was having a breakthrough. My authentic self finally demanding to use its own guidance system and get rid of the old one. For Camilla, burnout meant she'd come home from work unable to speak. Not that she wouldn't, it's that she couldn't. She'd sit in her car in the parking lot for 20 minutes, gathering the energy to walk to her apartment. And when she got there, she'd collapse on her couch and stay there until the next morning when she had to override her system all over again. But here's the complex reality of masking. It's not always about deception. Sometimes it's about becoming bilingual in operating systems. My ability to analyze social dynamics served me well in legal practice, and my pattern recognition skills now help me identify systemic inequities with surgical precision. Some of our overrides were brilliant adaptive solutions that we want to keep. Others were survival strategies that we want to evolve beyond. And we need to talk about why certain people's GPS systems stayed broken for decades. Because this isn't just about individual missed directions. It's about systematic navigation failure. The original GPS coordinates for neurodivergence were calibrated using very specific populations: young, white, male presentations of obvious differences. So when researchers programmed the first frameworks for autistic territory, ADHD landscape, and gifted minds, they were mapping from particular vantage points and documenting what was visible from where they stood. The problem with any guidance system programmed from a single perspective is that it mistakes partial coverage for complete territory. For decades, if your neurodivergent landscape didn't match those original coordinates, if you were female or assigned female at birth, if you were intellectually gifted, or if you developed a sophisticated override strategy, And if your cultural background shaped your expression of neurodivergence, well then, you were left with location not found or misrouted entirely. Here's the mathematics of diagnostic bias. If you're assigned female at birth, you're diagnosed with ADHD an average of 5 years later than boys. For autism, it's 18 months later. But that statistic doesn't capture women getting diagnosed in their 30s, 40s, 50s, or even 60s. And if you're from a racialized community, your neurodivergent traits are more likely to be pathologized as behavioral problems. And if you're intellectually gifted, your differences get masked by your compensatory abilities. But these aren't statistical accidents. They are the predictable results of GPS bias, of assuming that the routes you can navigate from your particular starting point represent all the possible destinations. Research by Dr. Sarah Bargiela reveals how autistic women develop what's called compensated autism. That is, presentations where natural traits are masked by learning social behaviors. Similarly, gifted individuals often develop what I call the compensated intensity, and that is to learn to dim your intellectual fire and moderate the emotional depth and then apologize for the complexity of your thoughts. You know what the cruel irony of all of this is? Is that this navigation expertise, this ability to travel neurotypical social routes with precision, becomes evidence against ourselves, because then professionals and others start saying, well, she's too social, or she makes eye contact, therefore she can't have ADHD. She finished college. As if neurodivergence were defined by incompetence rather than difference. Here's where internalized ableism becomes our own worst GPS technician. Even when we start to recognize neurodivergent routes in ourselves, we often dismiss our own navigational knowledge. We've been taught that neurodivergence looks like obvious struggle, and that competence and difference are mutually exclusive. So this internalized GPS bias keeps us lost even when we're holding accurate coordinates. Integration after late diagnosis isn't a destination. It's learning to consciously choose your routes instead of automatically following the override directions you've used for decades. Picture this. You've been driving in a foreign country for years. You have followed their traffic laws, you used their road signs, and believing this was the only way to travel. But then you discover you have citizenship in a completely different place. One with its own traffic patterns, its own guidance rules, and its own optimal routes. So the question isn't whether to abandon everything you have learned, but how to become consciously bilingual in operating systems. For me, integration meant learning to consciously choose when to use override and when to follow my authentic compass. I started paying attention to my actual responses to stimuli I had trained myself to ignore. The way my nervous system responds to fluorescent lights, or to unexpected sounds, or to social gatherings, or to changes in my routine. I've learned how to detect them and choose how I'm going to respond to them now that I understand how my brain works. I have rediscovered my stims, not the sanitized, invisible ones I had learned were acceptable, but the full body movements that actually helped my brain process information. I reconnected with my special interests and passionate pursuits, not the professionally appropriate ones I had cultivated, but the deep fascinations that lit up my nervous system and which, to be honest, probably makes me what people call a nerd. My friends still laugh when I spend entire weekends creating color-coded spreadsheets to organize my books by publication date, and then by emotional impact, and then by height within emotional impact categories. But now I understand that this isn't obsessive in the pejorative sense. This is how my gifted autistic mind naturally creates accessible, beautiful information systems. But here's the complex reality of route integration. It's not just personal, it's political. Every time you choose authentic wayfinding over social override, you are making a small but radical statement about whose ways of traveling deserve space in the world. When I started using noise-canceling headphones in public, I was making a visible and previously invisible route requirement. When I began stimming openly during virtual meetings, I was refusing to hide my navigation preferences for other people's comfort. And when I restructured my schedule around my natural energy patterns instead of conventional expectations, I was choosing authentic efficiency over external approval. Research shows that neurodivergent individuals who have access to accommodations, community, and self-understanding report significantly better mental health outcomes. But accommodation isn't a charity. It's acknowledging that the world was designed around one navigation system and expanding it to include others. Integration means becoming the lead navigator of your own life and creating routes that honor both your authentic neurology and your hard-won survival wisdom. One of the most profound aspects of late diagnosis is discovering that you are not traveling alone. You are part of a vast community of navigators who have been driving similar routes all along. The neurodivergent community, particularly online, has become something unprecedented in human history. A real-time, global route-sharing network where thousands of us are simultaneously exchanging directions for neurological territories that were previously unmapped or misrepresented. What's remarkable about these spaces is how they reveal the limitations of the original GPS programming. When autistic people, ADHDers, and gifted individuals, and multiple neurodivergent folks describe our own travel experiences, the internal landscape of sensory processing, the emotional terrain of intense interests, and the social geography we navigate daily, we are not just sharing personal stories. We are contributing to a collective cartography project that's reprogramming the official frameworks for neurodivergence. It's like Google Maps for neurodivergent people. Research by Dr. Damian Milton on the double empathy problem reveals something crucial about these community spaces. When neurodivergent people interact with other neurodivergent people, many of the supposed navigation difficulties simply disappear. We communicate efficiently, empathetically, and authentically. In neurodivergent community spaces, I don't have to translate my directness into neurotypical politeness. I can share intense interests without modulating my enthusiasm. I can stim openly, communicating in writing when speaking is difficult, and assume that differences in processing are accommodated rather than pathologized. But this community isn't just about comfort. It's about transformation. The neurodivergent community is actively reprogramming the narrative of what our differences mean and challenging deficit-focused approaches by demanding authentic representation and insisting that our ways of navigating have inherent value. We are not just sharing route information. We are changing the entire approach to navigation systems. We're creating our own neurodivergent Google Maps. We are moving from deficit-based routing, where they tell us here are the roads to avoid, to strength-based exploration, where we know that these are the optimal routes for this neurological profile. And here's what I want every late diagnosed person to know. Your discovery isn't just personal, it's political. Every time you recognize your authentic wayfinding needs, you're contributing to a larger project of resistance against neurological colonization. Your late diagnosis isn't late at all. It's right on time for a historical moment when we finally have the tools, the community, and the language to navigate neurological routes that were previously unmapped or misunderstood. We have traveled very far today, from GPS awakening to social override systems, from systemic failures to the revolutionary act of authentic route finding. If you take one thing from this journey, let it be this. Late diagnosed neurodivergence isn't a consolation prize or a delayed discovery. It's the story of extraordinary navigators who spent decades driving challenging routes with faulty GPS while developing remarkable skills of observation, adaptation, and survival along the way. Your pattern recognition that led you to understand your neurodivergence wasn't a coincidence. It was expertise. Your ability to finally see yourself clearly wasn't luck. It was wisdom. Your integration journey isn't remedial work. It's revolutionary wayfinding. You've been listening to Neuro Rebel, and I'm your host, Anita. If this episode challenged your thinking, validated your experiences, or gave you new coordinates for your own journey, please share it with someone who needs to hear it. You can find show notes, transcripts, and additional resources at neurorebelpodcast.com. Follow us on social media for continued conversation. And if this work adds value to your life, consider supporting it financially by buying me a cup of coffee. And not because you owe us anything, but because together we can keep mapping these routes for the travelers coming behind us. Remember, we don't need to be fixed, cured, or prevented. We need to be understood, supported, and valued for who we are. Until next time, thank you so much for listening. Keep questioning, keep navigating, and keep being beautifully, unapologetically neurodivergent.